Let's podcast alongside Demetri Ravanos.
Hello, Joe.
Joe Ovies. Doing things a little bit differently July 4th week. Demetri and I are going to be talking, I don't know, kind of like the state of the sports media industry, maybe?
Yeah, maybe we call it like OG stands on business.
maybe that's the case. On Tuesday's podcast, Joe Giglio sat down with NC State head basketball coach Kevin Keatts.
Oh, very good.
So we'll bring that to you on Tuesday. I still haven't figured out what we're going to be doing on Wednesday. I don't know. It's also like Carolina Hurricanes free agency.
Sure.
You know, I might pop in. This is technically recorded. Well, they're all recorded, but we recorded this almost 2 weeks ago.
Right.
But it is what it is. But the reason why we're kind of standing on business today is you and I have an unhealthy obsession with the Dan Le Batard show.
I think, you know, our old boss, Dennis, described it one time like perfectly why people like you and I like it. He said, you know, that when a boss listens to it, he hears chaos.
Yeah.
When you and I listen to it as people that were charged with making radio content, we hear revolution.
Yeah.
Or at least we did in the ESPN days.
At the time, and I heard it all the way back in my 850 The Buzz days when Dan Le Batard used to do a Sunday morning only show while he was at the Miami Herald. And he would bring on Bino Cook, and it was completely disruptive. You know, Bino would come on ESPN at that time and just be your classic cantankerous college football guy, right? But Le Batard would bring him on and like just poke him.
Yeah.
And get this kind of reaction out of him. And it was like, hey, man, here's a guy who doesn't take these things so seriously. He's disrupting stuff. And I thought it was a revelation. It made me think about sports completely different.
Right.
And when I would watch the sports reporters on ESPN and Le Batard was a part of that, he was that young guy who was kind of making things a little bit different. Now he's the old guy. We're all old guys now.
Absolutely.
And we're all trying to figure out what's next. And I think we kind of stumbled onto this conversation twofold. One, I texted you while I was driving in the deepest, darkest parts of Homestead coming out of the Everglades on my way up to Orlando, part of my Florida trip. And I was listening to 560 QAM ahead of what that was game 6. No, I'm sorry.
It had to be game 5.
It was game 5. It was game 5 of the Stanley Cup Finals. And I forget who the host was. And I texted you. I'm like, this is some of the worst sports talk radio I've ever heard. This guy doesn't sound like he even wants to be here today. Like you guys, you have a potential championship.
Yeah.
And you wanted to be anywhere but there. It was like flabbergasting to me.
Yeah.
Completely unprepared. I mean, it made me go, damn. I mean, you and I are like practically, you know, old school Keith Olbermann and Dan Patrick at this point, listening to this thing.
Right.
And then it dawned on me while I was driving. I'm like, no wonder when I see Reddit, when I see people talking about Dan Le Batard show, it's typically the Florida fans who still view Dan Le Batard as this local show that's going to talk about the Florida Panthers.
Yeah.
And sure enough, Dan Le Batard and the crew did something similar to when LeBron James was with the Miami Heat and they were chasing a championship and everybody hated the super team and all this other stuff. Dan was able to kind of thread this very unique needle at the time where you could be a local show that was also national at the same time because of LeBron James. And I feel like they were trying to go back to their bag of tricks over the last couple of weeks, trying to be a national show with the Connor McOverrated, trying to act like a hockey audience is the same as a national NBA audience. And it seems to have fallen flat and has spilled into, to get us to where we are and why we're having this conversation, it seems to have spilled into the sports media realm because the Dan Le Batard universe lore of Mike Ryan quitting because of a billboard and all this other stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, what are we doing here? What are we chasing?
So I'm gonna correct something you said just a tad because I do think it matters.
Okay.
I don't think with LeBron in Miami, Le Batard was doing a local show that was also a national show. I think he was doing a local show that was nationally relevant because of LeBron James. You could come at it from a very Miami perspective, and it still mattered to us in North Carolina, or at least those of us that were NBA fans in North Carolina, right? I would tell you that the host you were listening to in Miami reacts to hockey the way I think most Southern big cities react to hockey, which is, this isn't native to us. We just don't care. It's why the Thrashers didn't stay in Atlanta. It's why, the Florida Panthers play literally not in Miami, right?
No.
Tampa, Nashville, I'm shocked by the passion in those places. Raleigh, I'm not, because it's our only major league team, and we support that.
Mhm.
You know, we hoped it would be a building block kind of thing.
It's the thing that brings everybody together.
Right. But to your point, the hockey audience is not a national audience, and the Panthers audience is not moved by this at all. And so the thing that really stood out to me as kind of disappointing, and I'm not saying that Dan is lazy or anything like that. It's, you know, I go back to my time in rock radio, and I think about, you can have smaller things that are traditions, go-tos kind of thing. Like at 96 Rock, we used to do the Eliminator contest, where everybody would, we'd start with 100 prizes. And if your number got called, you got to knock off a prize. Whatever was standing at the end, that was the prize whoever won got.
That's why we call it Demetri's binder of radio bits.
That's right.
We all have our radio bits.
So that was what we did every year. And that was fine. I mean, to me, it never moved the needle, but it was whatever. But imagine, like, we gave away a Harley one time that was painted up in like a Led Zeppelin motif.
Okay.
Imagine if the next year we had done, I don't know, the Aerosmith Harley. And the year after that, we had done the Pink Floyd Harley. Like, at some point, you become the Harley station, right? Like, that's all that's in your bag of tricks. You know, Urkel could come in and say, did I do that a million times? But he could only turn into a car once.
Sure.
I think that's sort of what this billboard thing is. And when Dan describes it as his, quote, favorite joke, it's really disappointing because of the revolution that you and I hear. Like, when he put up those billboards in Cleveland, you know, saying you're welcome for the LeBron James that you got back.
Yeah.
It was a real thumb in the eye kind of thing. And yeah, it had to do with a bigger, higher profile individual and a story that more people were following. But it was also like, man, the ball's on that guy.
Yeah.
And now, not enough of us care about hockey. Like, I know the name Connor McDavid. I couldn't pick him out of a lineup.
Ratings have been good. But anyway.
I mean, look, fine. The ratings have been good.
Yeah.
But if I haven't watched, it doesn't matter if the ratings have been good.
That's fair.
I still don't know what's going on.
That's fair.
The other part of this, too, is this is Miami, one of the wealthiest land masses in the continent, picking on fucking Edmonton.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, like, Jesus Christ.
But you could say the same thing that they were picking on Cleveland.
That was about LeBron, though.
But it was about LeBron.
That was about LeBron post black hat LeBron.
But to kind of expand this out, and I just wanted to give the context of how we got here, because I think what's happening with Dan Le Batard speaks to what's happening with the sports media business in general.
Yeah.
And it all comes down to chasing the same thing. And in the last couple of weeks, there's been this conversation. I think it ties into the fact that House of the Dragon on HBO started its second season. And there's this kind of reminiscing of how it used to be with Game of Thrones leading up to its finale in 2017, where there was an entire industry based on Game of Thrones. And the thesis that was started back in 2017 by, at the time at Vox, Peter Kafka, he's now with Business Insider, and it was recently revisited by The Verge, in that a lot of today's media problems are related to Game of Thrones. And you're thinking, well, how is that?
Tell me more.
Like, how, what do you mean? Yeah. Well, back in the sweet 2010s, Google traffic defined everything.
Yeah.
And Facebook was flush with money, and they were trying to get people to do Facebook Live and more video, more pivot to video and things like that. And the one thing that was instant traffic was Game of Thrones. And of course it was. For people who never read the book, like me, and you're watching the show that everybody else wanted to talk about, well, how would I have a better understanding? Well, I started getting into the recaps. And at the time, AV Club, The Onion, had Game of Thrones for beginners and advanced.
Oh, interesting.
It was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So I would read the beginners, just so I'm like, okay, that's the name, that's how they're connected, blah, 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 blah. Then I would read the advanced. And they were tying in the book and everything else. The Ringer at the time made huge inroads on Game of Thrones stuff because of the fact that you had the Maester, and he would get into deep lore on a podcast. And that way it gave you an opportunity when you got together with your friends to talk about Game of Thrones that Monday. You're like, aha, but did you know, blah, 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 blah. So this turned everything, all these media companies, everything from The Atlantic to Uproxx, Like every publication had some sort of Game of Thrones beat.
You're leaving out somebody that really thrived on Game of Thrones content.
And that was?
Game of Thrones was a nice little gateway to, hey, maybe all immigrants should go back to where they came from. Like Clay Travis quadrupled his audience off of Game of Thrones recaps.
But yes, that's another example. And then it went away.
Yeah.
And then people didn't know what to do, and the traffic went away, and everybody's been chasing that high since. But of course, the landscape has changed, the platforms have changed, and I kind of see the same thing happening on YouTube with a lot of our sports shows. A lot of these guys kind of chasing the same thing, and that's chasing that sweet algorithm run. Le Batard shows openly talked about this, and that they see, anytime we talk about ESPN, numbers go up. Anytime we discuss Pat McAfee or other media intrigue, the numbers go up. And that's
insane, isn't it? Like, as somebody that has been in this business since he was 15, I don't understand why you people that aren't in the business care about us. I understand caring about the sports.
But we saw this with, and we can talk about this a little bit later on with Stephen A. Smith, because it ties into that. Why do you care so much about this media personality and not the sport? Because I do think they're tied. So this whole business of all chasing the same thing is also related to something that's fascinated me from Nilay Patel, who does a podcast called Decoder. And for the last couple of years, he has been pounding the table about his concept called Google Zero.
Okay.
And the concept of Google Zero is the day that arrives when all the Google referral traffic stops. And he used smaller outlets, like his favorite one is this. It was a website called HouseFresh.
Okay.
Based on the name, could you tell me what HouseFresh was about?
I'm going to guess it was about house music.
No, that would have been cool though. No, HouseFresh was about air filters.
Oh, sure.
So if you needed to know the best air filter, that was their entire shtick. Now you're probably wondering, wait a minute, there's an entire cottage industry about house filters. Well, yes, when you did a Google search, give me the best house filter, air filter. Well, that would show up. They'd give you detailed reviews and good to go. I remember getting sucked into this years ago when I was looking up baby car seats.
Mm-hmm.
There were message boards devoted to Britax versus Graco. Which one is better? Do you know how much I poured into looking over strollers? So you go to these websites and the Google traffic would wash in.
Yeah.
But then people got hip to that. Mm-hmm. And the larger outlets started to do the same thing. That's the Game of Thrones thing, right? But Google, in the last 6 months, has completely erased that by going AI. And now when you do a Google search, you're going to get these AI summaries. Now, those AI summaries aren't exactly good.
Coherent, yeah.
And they're also prioritizing paid advertisement for searches rather than the organic ones. And a lot of these websites like HouseFresh and whatnot have seen their traffic plummet because of a change in how Google does their search. Now, you're probably wondering, all right, Ovies, what the fuck does this have to do with sports media? Well, we always repeat the same mistakes. The newspaper industry went belly up. Everybody went, man, that sucks for the newspaper industry. It'll never happen to us. Well, guess what? It's happening to you too, because you refuse to adapt, or you decided to hinge yourself to the lifeboat that could change at any moment. And I think that's what's happening in sports media as it relates to YouTube. Mm-hmm. Everybody's chasing the same thing until when? Until Google, who has a history of killing products, has a history of changing the algorithm. We just saw this with Facebook and Meta and the newspapers and everything else. We saw it with BuzzFeed that got decimated the minute Facebook decided to change the way they diverted traffic. You don't own the platform. Mm-hmm. Google does.
Right.
So I find it weird that people haven't gotten the lesson that chasing traffic might feel good when it hits, but you're not actually building an audience.
It's because,
and there's a distinction.
Yeah, well, I mean, it requires an investment to change, right? An investment both financially and, I guess, in effort, right? Because the reason that nobody has changed from chasing traffic is because nobody has made the effort to educate buyers about what actually is an impactful impression. Right? Like there are still huge media agencies who's only looking at what podcasts have the most downloads or impressions or whatever, what radio stations have the highest ratings, what TV stations have the highest ratings, and not even listening to what the content is or doing research about who the audience is, just saying that's the biggest, I'll take that.
Okay.
And it's so much easier to do it that way and to build up your numbers than it is to sit down and explain to these people why it is that maybe the 3,500 that every single day listen to Ovies and Giglio might be better than the 10,000 that have the radio on in the background and are not actively paying attention.
It's not active. It's also, too, again, the difference between traffic and audience, and something that I've had to teach myself or just rewire my brain after being so caught up in traffic. It's that is not loyal audience. That is not something that's repeatable. That is lightning in a bottle, which again gets back to Le Batard and others in that what exactly are you chasing? Oh, well, we got to do this radio bit. We got to create this palace intrigue about whether Mike Ryan's going to quit over a billboard, and that'll be the thing that gets people going. Or Le Batard going on some sort of rant about the industry and Stephen A. Smith. Well, you know what? That's going to give me the sweet, sweet audience. But then it goes away. This was evident during the Stanley Cup finals or during the Stanley Cup playoffs for the Carolina Hurricanes. Right?
Okay.
So we were doing the OG After Dark.
Yeah.
And, our audience, Canes fans, wanted something and they got it. But a funny thing happened when the Rangers series came around. We did, for relatively speaking, we did great on those After Darks. I'm thinking, oh, okay, cool. But the way YouTube would have me do it, I'd be a Rangers podcast.
Right.
Because what ended up happening was all the Rangers fans got caught up in our slipstream, and we were getting more Rangers fans in our stuff than we were Canes fans. Why? Because the algorithm, because the platform decided that's what they're going to see.
Yeah. I mean, I think
that's not my audience, though.
No, 100%. I think that one of the things that speaks to is I certainly think this town gets more and more invested in the Canes the better they are. And of course, that means the deeper they go in the playoffs. But what does that mean? Does that mean everybody's watching? Or does that mean that you're checking your app, your ESPN app or your Score app mid-game? Like, personally, and I've never hidden this, so I'm not, I could care less what the Hurricanes do, right? But, that Rangers series, I was checking the ESPN app to see what they were doing. Now, this year was very interesting because since I was a kid, been a diehard Celtics fan, and the Eastern Conference Finals in both the NBA and NHL seem to be playing on the same night.
Yeah.
Right. And I was never going to switch away from the Celtics to watch the Hurricanes. But because that's my town, because it meant so much to my kid, I did want to know what was going on. But I'm not the type of person that's going to go look up an OG After Dark. So my point in saying all of that is that I think the way these algorithms are built right now, and to your point, it could change at any moment. It definitely behooves people, especially people like Le Batard, who are getting paid in the tens of millions, to chase the lowest common denominator.
That gets into growth versus sustainability.
Exactly.
So there's another person I'll reference. There's been like three main sources of kind of like leaning on where they see things in the technology field. That's another aspect of this as well. It's funny how in the sports media industry, we're really arguing about 500,000 subscribers being this huge number. And it is. I'm not dismissing 500,000 subscribers. I would absolutely take the 600,000 subscribers that Stephen A. Smith has on YouTube. Okay. Don't get me wrong. Or what Shannon Sharp has been able to build on his platforms as well. But you look at what they're fighting over versus what I see in the tech space, right? Like Marquise Brownlee is killing it on the tech front, right? You see what some others are able to do, and we're talking numbers on YouTube that dwarf anything you will see in sports. Hell, some of the YouTube grifter stuff, or the Star Wars grifter stuff, dwarfs anything you see on sports. So it's all relatively speaking. But I do wonder if in that chasing of growth, you're also kind of missing the forest from the trees. This gets me to another newsletter that I subscribe to called Garbage Day. I've forwarded you a couple of these. And Ryan Broderick does a good job of he's kind of like my go-to internet beat writer.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
Because you need somebody to kind of, at this age, now that I'm 45, I'm not extremely online like I used to be, but I still want to know what's going on. Ryan does a really good job of kind of explaining where things are currently at.
So are you not caught up on all the if I said Huck Tua, do you know what that is? And if I said this is going to ruin the tour?
I would know about that. I would know about that too. I would know about that as well. No, but his whole point is he's kind of done this newsletter thing, is that he's at a point where, I've kind of grown to where I'm going to be. Now it's about sustaining it.
Yep.
And I do wonder if getting back to a lot of these, I was reading a Ben Strauss piece about Stephen A. Smith in the Washington Post recently, where Stephen A. just continues to want to grow. And he wants more YouTube numbers. He wants more ratings. He wants this. But at some point you go, there's a cap to all this.
Yeah.
Eventually you're going to have to break free from sports altogether if you really want to grow.
Yeah.
So for those of us in sports, to tie this back to sports real quick, like Dan Le Batard, you either have to make the decision that you're comfortable with the audience you have, and you are going to essentially nurture that audience that you've had and sustain it, or you're going to keep chasing that dragon. And I feel like the mistake that a lot of us end up making in the long run is we end up chasing that traffic, not understanding that the next hot young thing is going to take it from you, whether you like it or not. You could do all the things you want to do, but the young people are going to go do the thing that they're comfortable with. In this case, it's Pat McAfee.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get Pat McAfee. I don't get it.
Yeah.
I legitimately do not understand Pat McAfee.
Okay.
But then I realized, well, I'm also old.
Yep.
And it's not meant for me in the same way that the stuff that I was consuming when I was younger was not meant for my parents.
Yeah.
And once you kind of hit that revelation, you go, all right, you know what? It's okay. He can have his thing.
Yeah.
Because there's still an audience that exists for us.
Yeah.
And this is where I think Bill Simmons finally figured it out. You know why Bill Simmons, in my opinion, still, unlike Dan Le Batard, still actually is successful.
Okay.
And isn't constantly stumbling over himself in the same way that Le Batard seems to? Is because at the end of the day, Simmons just gives you takes.
Yep.
When's the last time you heard an actual take from Dan Le Batard?
About games, I could not tell you.
About an actual sporting event.
Yeah.
Like
that's a good
actual
point.
games, not this big, long story about how football is destroying body. I could do all the Dan Le Batard cliches, right?
Right.
Large men crashing into each other and, blah, 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 blah. Barbaric, all this other stuff. Man, some people just want to tune in and like, what do you think about the game?
Yeah. I mean, listen, I've told this story before. Like when I was making the move from entertainment radio, let's call it, to sports full time.
Yeah.
One of the best things that happened to me was Mike Maniscalco stopping me as I was trying to come up with a bit around a Duke game and going, Demetri, sometimes I just want to hear us talk about fucking basketball.
Yeah, man. And I've had arguments with management about that.
Yeah.
Look, we've dealt with consultants. I've dealt with program directors back in the radio days about, all right, so this thing is happening.
Right.
We need to do this big thing around it. And sometimes I'm like, y'all, sometimes people just want to tune in and think and just want to hear what you think.
Yeah. I mean, listen, I will. So I've been for Barrett Sports Media. I just wrapped working on this series called Meet the Betters, where I talk to a lot of people about betting content, right?
Yeah.
Like, I talk to everybody from Mike Francesa to the Bear to, all kinds of people.
Our guy Mincy.
Yes. Our guy Mincy was a part of that. It is interesting to me, the number of people that very quickly, when they started doing this as content, be it on radio, digital, whatever, realized, oh, numbers are fucking boring. Like, you've got to tell a story. Now, in their mind, and this was something that John Jastrzemski of The Ringer pointed out to me. He said, what was really tough is, in my mind, the numbers tell the story. The numbers are the story, but I've got to figure out a way. Even the most hardcore bettor still wants to listen, because that guy, the guy that lives and breathes this stuff, he thinks he knows better than you.
Yeah.
Right. So now you have to figure out, how do I get the average fan knowing that the average fan is not going to be entertained by you winning. They're going to be entertained by being entertained. Right. So it's interesting, right? I can't even remember how I started talking about this.
It's fine. We're just riffing, man.
Yeah, I'm just going. I will say this, going back to your point about McAfee. You and I'm a happy medium of where you are and his audience. I think McAfee is great in those short YouTube clips.
Sure.
I cannot watch the show because for the same reason. Like, for me, I'm just not part of the audience.
I'll give this to McAfee. McAfee nailed what I came to too late.
Okay.
And something that I had argued for the longest time, that the 3 hours of content that he's producing on a daily basis isn't the point.
Right.
The point is to hopefully in those 3 hours, you got something that you can repackage.
Right.
And that's where you make your money.
Right.
And it's something that I feel like radio in particular lost, much like the newspaper business trying to understand a digital content strategy. Radio lost because they refused to understand that you're literally creating 3 to 4 hours of content a day.
Yeah.
A day. You're telling me that in those 3 to 4 hours of content, you can't repackage 10 minutes?
Right.
You can't repackage 90 seconds?
Right.
You tell me you can't do that and monetize it. That to me was a failure of most radio.
Yeah.
And because I get it, old habits die hard. You're trying to milk everything you have out of the old type of business. It's hard to try to make, try to understand the new business and go. And I think McAfee figured that out a long time ago. And McAfee also, let's be real, sometimes people just don't want to think. They don't want to overthink.
Yeah.
They just want to vibe.
Yeah.
And I think I'll give credit to McAfee there too, that the reason why he has access to the athletes that he has is because unlike a Dan Le Batard show, which 10 years ago, it was, ooh, what provocative question is Dan Le Batard going to ask this person? Like, hey, can you, let's, if I'm being Le Batard here, can we tap into this trauma? And let's just have it out for 20 minutes.
Right.
And some athletes don't want to go on and talk about the trauma again.
It's what
you go on with McAfee, and it's like, hey man, we're just chilling. We're just having a good time. And you're not going to ask me very hard probing questions.
Right. So McAfee is, in my opinion, and I will reiterate, I think he's very good at what he does.
Sure.
I think that he is that next level up of an athlete podcast, where I think that McAfee does think about, is my audience entertained right now, in a way that like JJ Redick and LeBron just don't. They just don't give a shit.
No.
And that's fine. I mean, like, there are parts of those podcasts that are really interesting, but I think those podcasts will always have trouble building the average fan base, the average guy like you and me, the loyalty there, because there's just not enough in it for us to keep coming back.
Yeah.
It is very interesting to hear an athlete talk about the deep X and O of a certain play or a certain series, or how they defend a certain guy. But not everybody can keep that same level as they change topics, right?
Yeah.
So maybe Pat Beverly has a lot to say about Chris Paul. But it doesn't necessarily mean when he talks about how much he hates Chris Paul, doesn't mean he can translate that energy over to what it's like playing with Giannis Antetokounmpo.
I got you.
You know what I mean?
I got you.
And I think that McAfee recognizes that is not in his strong suit, and B, also really embraces the idea of being and these are his words, the quote unquote dumb kicker.
Yeah.
Right. He very much embraces being inside, but also kind of on the outside.
But he has an audience.
Right.
That's ultimately what it comes down to. He knows what his audience wants. He understands he's built an audience. He makes them feel part of. I mean, when they have, as they secure the bag, he always is like, hey, man, we can't do this without you.
Yep.
And again, while I don't get McAfee, what I do get is the concept of holding on to an audience, sustaining it, and then having it grow with you over time as people want to be a part of it.
There's a model in there, by the way. He is doing for young men 30 and below exactly what Jimmy Fallon is doing for 50 and above.
Yes.
He is bringing on people that are big names, and he is getting them comfortable and engaging them in ways beyond just, hey, tell me what's on your mind, or tell me about the new project.
So all of this to put a wrap on this particular segment of where we are right now, I do wonder when the light bulb is going to go on for a lot of these folks. And it's not just in the podcast game, the YouTube game, but it's also in the sports radio game, in that, are you spending time just chasing that traffic, or are you actually spending time to try to cultivate an audience? And it's now that I've been able to step back and I've been thinking about it, and I've been reading these tech pieces about all these types of things, I think it's been easier for me to identify, you might be making a mistake here.
Yeah.
And in the long run, it's going to hurt you. And you spent so much time trying to chase that thing that you forgot why you got here in the first place. And at some point, you have to just be comfortable with sustainability rather than growth.
Well, I mean, you say radio, like it's television too. And here's McAfee is a really good example. We don't know at the time we're recording this. McAfee has not signed his contract to come back to College Game Day next year.
Nice.
We assume he will, but at the time we're recording this, he hasn't yet. And so it's a little bit of a scuttlebutt. And I wrote about this for Barrett Sports Media because my immediate reaction was, okay, well, if he doesn't re-sign, you've got Nick Saban. But more importantly, do you need 3 hours? Like, you control all of the SEC and all of the ACC and part of the Big 12. That's a big chunk of teams on the East Coast. Give me an 11 a.m. kickoff.
Yeah.
In the show an hour earlier and give me an 11 a.m. kickoff.
We'll get to that because games are a thing.
Yes.
Let's thank some sponsors here, and then we can talk about what exactly are we entering into with some of these big contracts that are on deck.
Housekeeping.
Big thanks to Enovana for sponsoring housekeeping. Check them out online at enovana.com, ENOVANA.com. Green Cleaning Solutions.
If you have mess inside your mansion or trash in your cabana, get it green clean with Enovana.
Of course, the big housekeeping note is we've got Podcast Festival tickets on sale right now. August 24th at the Rialto. It's going to be us, Hand in the Dirt, and of course the headliner, Shutdown Fullcast. Spencer Hall and the crew are going to be there. I can't think of a better way to kick off the college football season, week 0, than hanging out with all your friends at the Rialto and 3 podcasts, plus exclusive merch from Homefield. Homefield is getting it done with a hoodie I'm really, really excited about. You want access to that? By all means, buy tickets today and head on over to the Rialto for our week 0 podcast festival. In the meantime, if you go to Homefield's website and homefieldapparel.com, I believe our promo code is still working, OG23. I saw that they had pumped out a really sweet NC State dad hat recently. Use that promo code. It's still kicking, OG23. And of course, the podcast festival is brought to you by Breeze Through. Check them out at breezethrough.com. Locations across the triangle. Make sure you download the app. That way you save money on pumping gas. Coming back from that road trip all throughout Florida, let me tell you, saving money on gas is pretty crucial. So we thank our friends at Breeze Through for sponsoring the podcast festival. So by supporting us, you can support them. Go to breezethrough.com. Also, big thanks to Two Roosters. Check them out online at tworoosters.com. It is peak ice cream season, folks. It is hot. It is gross. You want to cool down. You want to treat yourself. Check out Two Roosters across the triangle. Big thanks to Matt Davis over at State Farm as well. InsureGardner.com, TheOGInsurance.com, or call them directly at 919-779-8277. After having come back from vacation and trying to cut back on things, I think I'm all in on the Cali Sober lifestyle. You can explore that at naturesreliefhempstore.com. Again, that's naturesreliefhempstore.com, LEAF hempstore.com. You got questions, they've got answers. You're looking for better sleep. You're looking for seltzers. You're looking for edibles. It's all there at Nature's Relief Hemp Store. And of course, big thanks to our friends over at Longleaf Swine. Check them out online at longleafswine.com. So I was reading Puck News.
Mm-hmm.
John Oran now is over at Puck, and it's worth the subscription, actually.
I was about to say, I just have to point out for people that don't know, look at you, Mr. Moneybags.
I know,
because
right?
a Puck subscription is not cheap.
Listen, all I know is that Gilio told me in order for this business, this LLC to operate, we have to spend money
Fair.
to keep it away from the tax man.
Fair.
I'm like, well, I know one industry publication I will absolutely use company money to buy. But I find Puck really, really insightful, and it really gives me a good behind the scenes information, what's going on. And I saw John Oran report that ESPN was preparing or has an offer on the table for Stephen A. Smith to the tune of $18 million.
Yep.
I'm like, damn, that's really impressive.
By the way, significant number because it is $1 million more per year than Troy Aikman makes, who is their highest paid employee at the moment.
Which is important. But Stephen A. Smith doesn't just want to be the highest paid employee at ESPN. He wants to make more money than anybody associated with ESPN, which also involves our guy, Pat McAfee,
right,
who has a licensing deal with ESPN. Because remember, Pat McAfee is not an employee of ESPN.
That's right.
He licensed his show back to ESPN to the tune of $25 million. And Stephen A. Smith wants that money. He wants to be the top dog in terms of financials. And ESPN seems willing to play ball with this. And it makes me wonder, is Stephen A. Smith really worth that? You are what the market says you are. I get that. But is Stephen A. Smith really worth that amount of money? Or is ESPN better suited trying to cultivate the next Stephen A. Smith? Because Stephen A. is a homegrown ESPN talent. Yes, he had his columnist days, but he is a surefire, homegrown ESPN built guy.
Yeah. No, he's not worth it. And this is not about Stephen A. Smith, because whether you like him or not, Stephen A. Smith knows how to command an audience.
Yes, he does.
Right. Nobody is worth $25 million a year anymore because, and we alluded to this earlier, certainly there are people that have like their guy, right? Like beyond just being one of our good friends. I think both you and I, when there's a big event in sports, we want to hear what Bomani has to say about it.
Yes, we do.
He's our guy. So there are people that feel that way about Stephen A. Smith. But in 2024, there are so many people doing that. And there are so many different options to go and find not just an opinion, but the exact opinion that you want. That the only thing that is worth 8 figures a year, and even more than that, is live play-by-play rights.
Yes.
And by the way, what we have learned is whether it is a major talent like a Pat McAfee or a Stephen A. Smith, or even a non-A tier play-by-play, you still take the play-by-play every time.
I'll reference another thing from the Garbage Day newsletter. And it was in reference to the idea that Twitter was back.
Yeah.
Right. And Ryan's whole point is that no, Twitter is not back. It's just a bunch of political reporters who cannot disengage themselves from that echo chamber. And they're thinking it's 2011, right? Not understanding that, no, we've hit another point in decentralized internet. There's not one monolithic thing anymore. And the point was, it doesn't feel like an election year because everything has become so decentralized the way it was back in the day. We forgot what it's like when people are not just glued to one thing and one thing only all the time, and they get away from that cycle. And I feel like the same thing is with Stephen A. Smith. The point that Ryan made was, yeah, all these cable news channels that people obsess over, who are they really speaking to? Look at the numbers.
Yeah.
They're not great.
Look, Fox News is rightfully considered a juggernaut in cable television.
But
do you know the primetime hours where they dominate cable television? The mean age of their audience is 69. Nice. Right? Which means over half of the audience is over 70.
And Ryan's point was these shows are basically being broadcast to empty waiting rooms.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I've thought the same thing about a lot of these ESPN shows.
I wish I could remember who had the great line that, pardon the interruption, is the show that America experiences in gyms and airport bars.
Yes, absolutely. And sure enough, with my travel, I can see that ESPN is over a bar television.
Yep.
I can see that it's at a gym and those types of things. Is that worth $25 million?
No.
Then why does ESPN find themselves in this situation where they basically want the network to be 3 people?
Okay, so that
Stephen A., Mike Greenberg, and Pat McAfee.
It was a strategy I actually thought made sense when Jimmy Pitaro first had it. But again, that's pre-pandemic.
Jimmy Pitaro is the ESPN president.
Right. He is the boss, the guy making these decisions. He had the idea of, rather than paying 300 people $1 million a year each, let's say, to be all over ESPN, he's going to pay 10 people $300 million, like over the course of a contract, each, to be on everything. And that's why you have Mike Greenberg's a really good example. When they signed that deal, Greenberg had Get Up. Remember, at the time, he was the host of NBA Countdown. He hosts the NFL Draft. He has his radio show. And I think he had some sort of like Sports Center interview special as well.
He also had a better show too. Remember,
right,
ESPN
that's what it was.
Which I always thought, like, who wants to watch reenactments of guys on a 12-game parlay? That's not me, but it is what it is. But I will counter this with Mike Greenberg. Mike Greenberg makes sense for that amount of money because he is an MC.
Yeah.
He is trying to find the right way to put this, is somebody who actually
he's the ringmaster.
Yes. And this comes from somebody who is very open about the fact that as much as Mike Greenberg, people love to shit on Mike Greenberg, I don't think people recognize how good he is at his job. In the same way that Ryan Seacrest, oh God, he's everywhere. No, because he's really good at being a host.
Yeah.
A traffic cop.
Listen, I always described Mike and Mike as, and this, by the way, is making your point, even though it sounds like an insult.
Yeah.
Mike and Mike was not a sports show. It was the Today Show for sports fans, right? And the Today Show works because it is a well-oiled machine. There is a reason, as like bad at broadcasting as Al Roker is, that they keep him around, because Al Roker keeps the trains running on time. And that's how those shows work.
That's how it has to work, right? So, and I've always kind of viewed myself as a poor man's version of a Mike Greenberg. And I'm like, look, man, I'm just trying to keep the trains on time.
Yep.
I might go over, we might go this, that, but I'm trying to keep the conversation
So here's
moving.
my counterpoint.
So I get why Mike Greenberg makes that money and why he was hosting all these shows, because he's good at it.
Sure. So here's my counterpoint. And maybe in the new version of how he experienced media, maybe that holds a little more weight. But if he is just the guy that keeps the trains running and he's not bringing any additional eyeballs, is he really the one that is worth that huge contract?
Well, my argument is that somebody has to do it.
Sure.
So which also gets to Stephen A. Smith. And maybe here I'm making the argument, maybe Stephen A. Smith is worth it in the same way that Charles Barkley is worth whatever he was worth on Inside the NBA. You do need somebody that says something that keeps the conversation, interesting. And whatever you want to say about Stephen A. Smith, the man has a way to get either himself or his opinion to be part of the conversation, unlike anybody else.
So
and if that's what you're paying for, to keep ESPN in that orbit of, hey, the conversation center around what this guy has to say, well, then maybe you do want to keep him for that amount of money.
I think the difference between Stephen A. and Barkley, and it's really important, is that when I am watching where Barkley is the signature element inside the NBA, I don't have a doubt that Barkley has watched the action he is talking about. Okay. I know we all poke fun at his NCAA coverage. That's fine, but he gets to do that because of what he's built up on inside the NBA.
Yeah.
I think ESPN has done Stephen A. Smith a disservice by making him the catalyst through which the whole network flows, because as somebody, and I love college football, not just Alabama, I watch everything.
Yeah.
The second Stephen A. Smith opens his mouth about college football, I think, oh, this guy didn't watch.
I'm out.
Like when he is sitting there trying to lecture Paul Feinbaum on the realities of the SEC, it's embarrassing. And so, and I don't think that is look, Stephen A. Smith certainly has a healthy ego, but I don't think Stephen A. Smith wants to put himself in a position of looking that way.
Yeah.
Right.
But I'll go back to that Strauss piece that are in the Washington Post and what he's discovered on his own podcast. I did not realize he employs 15 people for that podcast.
Yeah.
That's shocking. It's one of those things where it's like, hey, why don't you guys do X, Y, Z? It's like, well, because it's really just two people.
It's okay. I'm glad you said, because this is something that I wanted to bring up when you were talking about the way local radio ties into this whole chasing.
Chasing dragon.
Local radio also has a long history of not realizing what it is they're aspiring to. When I started at 96 Rock, we were told, hey, we want the daily show on the radio. It's like, great. They have a staff of 24 putting on 30 minutes of content 4 days a week.
Yeah.
You're asking Salt and I, two people for 4 hours a day.
Right. Right.
And then when I got with Mike and Lauren, we want a local Levitard. Okay, well, they have 8 producers.
I remember with one consultant, and the consultant, they showed me and Gilio a thing about Hot Ones. And it was like, this is just an incredible interview. And this is how all your interviews have to be. And I'm thinking to myself, well, Hot Ones comes out once a week.
Right.
It's edited. There's a hook. And they also have 20 people working on this whole particular thing. We are doing, it's a completely different format.
Right.
I'm not saying what they're doing isn't great. I'm just saying it's a different setup.
Yeah.
We're here to churn it out.
Also, could you imagine,
baby?
Could you imagine bringing Chip Patterson on to talk about, does Mac Brown still have it on the recruiting trail, and doing an interview like that? Like, it's a completely different goal.
It's a totally different thing. It's a totally different thing. So to tie it back to Stephen A. Smith and what I think he's discovered on his podcast with that side tangent is, Strauss points out, one of the things that went really, really popular was him getting a question about Pokemon.
Right.
And what does Stephen A. Smith know about Pokemon?
Yeah.
But the way he was reading the names, you come to find out that somebody on staff is feeding him information and all that kind of stuff. Or when somebody asked him about the Piston Cup from Cars.
Lightning McQueen.
Right. It's like the Lightning McQueen. That was great. Again, somebody was feeding him the information. But what the reason why people were watching that clip is because it was funny to see this guy who has no concept of cars pronounce the way that he was doing. And he was doing it in the Stephen A. style.
Yes.
That's why you're watching, right?
Are you telling me Chick Hicks?
It's funny.
Yeah.
It's funny, right? So I think that's why I'm kind of arguing in favor of Stephen A. Smith making $25 million because who else on ESPN can do that?
Yeah, I'm saying ESPN can probably get that for less
Who's doing it, though?
I don't think it matters necessarily, because at the end of the day,
like Dominic Foxworth is not going on my television.
I agree.
To do that. And I love Dominic.
But here's the thing, and I think this is something that people, especially the people that get all up in arms about, oh, everything's betting now.
Yeah.
I think this is what you have to understand. It's not just about betting. It's about the importance of games. There's a reason that NBA finals ratings can be going down and the price of carrying NBA games can be going up.
Yeah.
Right? If ESPN wanted to, they could take all of that stuff that's on ESPN Plus. And I'm talking about not just like, Patriot League lacrosse. I mean, like France second level soccer. And they could be showing live sports around the clock, framing it in different ways. And I don't think they would be doing, I think they would be doing better. But at the worst, I don't think they would be doing significantly worse than paying $25 million for the ratings First Take gets. Yes, it's number one in its time slot, but that's a depressed time slot.
You just said something that gets me to a theory of mine that I think is coming to fruition, and why I think people were getting the conversation around the NBA ratings wrong, and why it ties into the other fascinating media thing that ate up a good chunk of this early summer, which I'll explain next. Big thanks to our friends at Roback. Go online, roback.com. Use that promo code OG20 to save 20% off your order. Having just come back from Florida, walking around Disney, the Roback shorts were absolutely clutch. It's gross out. You need something that's comfortable, moisture wicking, keeps you cool. Roback's got it. Again, check them out, roback.com. Use that promo code OG20 to save 20% off your order. Speaking of post-vacation blues, man, I ate a lot of rich food, a little too much. It's time to get right. It's time to go to Happy and Hale.
Let's take a break. Let's take a hockey break. Brought to you by Happy and Hale.
As again, we're recording this, so we don't quite know what's going to happen with NHL free agency and whatnot, but we're going to talk about it. And every time we take that hockey break, it's thanks to our friends at Happy and Hale. They got great smoothies. Download the app. You can save and get some freebies along the way. Also, big thanks to Mosquito Authority and Pest Authority. As much as I've been talking about Mosquito Authority, it's hot, it's gross, you don't want to get bitten up. With the heat, you got critters that are trying to come in the house. Pest Authority can help out with that. So bundle and save at bugsbite.com. Whitaker and Hamer, they've been an OG corporate champion from the jump. We thank them. WH.lawyer, attorneys and counselors at law. And of course, we've got our friends at Hometown Realty. Buying and selling, you can do it with confidence. Thanks to Hometown Realty. Check them out at myhtr.com. New construction's big right now. A lot of builders have incentives. Well, how do you find out about that stuff? Again, Hometown Realty can help you out. And after you've purchased that home, you got that brand spanking new kitchen, you got that outdoor kitchen you've been dreaming of, there's no better way to celebrate than to throw something on from the Butcher's Market. So check them out, thebutchersmarkets.com, locations across the triangle. One other housekeeping note, thanks to our friends at Crank Arm Brewing. They bring you Hey Joe, and they're also going to bring you our OG Summer Jam. That's going to take place a little bit later in July. We'll have more details for you when we're all back ready to go after the July 4th holiday. But be on the lookout for some information. It's going to be at the end of July. It's going to be a lot of fun. Butcher's Market's going to be in the house. And better yet, you're chilling at the pool. You're entertaining. You want to have some great beer. Crank Arm Brewing is the way to go. Check them out online at crankarmbrewing.com. So let's wrap our little state of the sports media landscape on something that you had referenced regarding NBA ratings and television deals and everything else. I don't know Ethan Strauss. I don't know if I'll ever know Ethan Strauss. Yeah. I just know that I subscribe to his Substack because he gets interesting people on his podcast. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of things he has to say. And one of the things that I really would yell at my car stereo while listening to his podcast was related to the NBA and the television rights. And he was always talking about how, oh man, the television rights for the NBA are going to suck. This is a really bad situation for the NBA. He was a doomer. Just big doomer when it came to the NBA as somebody who's been around the NBA for a long time. And I always disagreed with that sentiment. And it actually ties into a conversation that I've had with Bomani Jones, Mr. Economist, around, okay, if we all recognize that the NBA ratings suck, how do we then also understand that the NBA is still worthwhile, still has value, while it basically props up an entire industry of things?
Mm-hmm.
The NFL is king. Straight up, hard stop, nobody's going to come for them. But second to that, in terms of culture, conversation, everything that is around the sport, nobody does it like the NBA.
Yeah.
The NBA dominates your social media feed. There's a bazillion podcasts about the NBA. It fills up hours of programming on ESPN and on talk shows and things like that. So while the ratings suck, it still does move the needle in some shape or form. And my argument was the NBA's biggest leverage point outside of having inventory, which is important, was that you can't have this culture. You can't have all the things that you do revolving around our sport without us.
Yeah.
And that's why I always viewed value in the NBA. And sure enough, they're going to triple or whatever it is, their NBA rights package whenever that finally comes due across multiple networks. So I feel like my theory is right. The NBA, in a way, was almost like the future of sports media in that, yeah, not as many people are watching, but there's still interest, and that's how you keep it going. And I feel like that ties into what we saw with Shams Charania and Adrian Wojnarowski too. People love the gossip in the NBA,
Oh, sure.
man. They love that gossip, but you need the NBA in order to keep having that gossip.
The NBA, better than any other league, has consistently accepted and leaned into the fact that the players being superstars is good for us.
Yes.
You know, the NFL literally puts a mask on their biggest celebrities.
Right.
Baseball, now granted, this was pre-Shohei Ohtani, but I think a lot of us in the industry, at least, and probably a lot of you, remember when that stat came out that said, in terms of Q score, in terms of recognizability, Mike Trout, who at the time was the biggest star in Major League Baseball, was less recognizable than Jay Crowder, who was at best a sixth man.
Yeah.
You know, in the NBA. And yeah, to your point, Shams and Woj have gotten to this point where they are name dropped by rappers because they have built a career. And look, we can argue whether or not it was all above board or if there was some squashing of competition or relationships, blah, blah, blah. But they have built a career on being the gatekeeper to the information about the superstars.
Now, I do think, and this has been bothering me, JJ Redick should be the coach of the Lakers. Fine, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm not all that interested in whether or not he actually has the resume to be the head coach of the Lakers, other than, hey, you seem to have made an in with LeBron James, and that's why you have the job.
Avery Johnson literally walked off the court to become the coach of the Mavericks.
Right. Like, come on now. Okay. The real story, the one that I hope everybody finally peeped the game, if you will, was what happened between Shams Charania, who was a Padawan under the Adrian Wojnarowski Jedi stewardship, and has now surpassed the master. Okay. And Woj did not really take that well.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll reference Ethan Strauss again because he had Amin Al-Hassan on recently. Darth Amin on Twitter. He's part of the Le Batard network and everything else. Amin used to be in NBA front offices. And the most brilliant thing he's ever said that's made me completely rethink how I interact with our colleagues in sports media that break news is that they're not actually breaking news. They're just telling you the transaction before the transaction is public.
Yeah.
It's not they are the ones that get to be the gatekeeper, and that it's all an illusion that somehow Wojnarowski is the one, on the pavement talking to his sources. No, he's the final arbiter of what that particular person wants people to know. Yeah. It's not actually breaking news. It's breaking a transaction. You are getting the press release out before the actual press release. Because really in sports, what is the value of breaking news? At some point or another, I'm going to get an email from the Carolina Hurricanes that they made a trade.
Exactly.
Or they, with free agency. Oh, okay. So they didn't get Gensel. Okay, cool. Got it. I was going to find that out eventually. This is not breaking the world open, right? So what I think ended up happening with Shams being able to get to the real story of JJ Redick being the next head coach of the Lakers, and why it took so long. JJ Redick wanted to make sure that he wasn't upsetting people at ESPN, waiting for not to make that not a distraction while he was on the call. I thought JJ did the right thing. I'm not going to make this about me while the NBA finals are going on. And in due time, it will be about me. But in the meantime, I don't want to make it about me. Okay. Woj didn't like this. Woj trying to flex to essentially let people know that I can still make NBA front offices do things that I want them to do.
Mm-hmm.
Almost sort of kind of was in on the Dan Hurley thing.
Yeah.
That it was more Wojnarowski wanted his guy to be a part of the Lakers more so than the Lakers and even Dan Hurley wanted the Lakers to be together.
Maybe. I mean, look.
And that all was to screw Shams. Because again, as Amin pointed out, there's a long, and these are all public things. All you do is Google search Adrian Wojnarowski. There's multiple instances in which Adrian Wojnarowski has undercut his own colleagues at his own networks.
Yep.
Even guys like Brian Windhorst about certain reports that they got before him.
Yeah.
And you cannot out Woj. He's going to take it really, really badly.
Yeah. This goes beyond the NBA, right? The reason, and to your point, Woj wanted to get his guy as part of the Lakers saga just so he could have a scoop that Shams didn't. All these guys across sports have their agent relationship, right? Like, you don't have to search very hard to find out that if something's happening in the NBA through CAA, Woj will have it before anybody else. If something's happening through the agency United Talent, Shams will have it before anybody else.
But do fans recognize this?
I think that's a good question.
Because you could do this with Adam Schefter. You could do this with Mel Kiper.
You could do this
with draft. The point is, I feel like the Shams Woj thing and the Dan Hurley thing finally, I hope, put sunlight on, you understand what's really happening here.
Yeah.
There's no actual breaking news.
Yeah.
Period. It's all an illusion.
I talked to somebody one time that was offered the chance to have Shams on every week on his show. And he outright to the sponsor that wanted Shams on said, that dude has value 2 weeks out of the year. I'll have him on every day for those 2 weeks, but I'm not doing him every week on the show. And I think that is where the idea of this finally shines the light loses some steam. Like, by the time we get to those 2 weeks, so many other things have happened that we've absolutely forgot. By the way, by next month, or at least by the start of the college basketball season, we'll have to be reminded that Dan Hurley interviewed for the Lakers job.
Easily.
Yeah.
Easily.
So, no, I don't think it has staying power.
I think it's a good thing to talk about in June. You know, I appreciate the illusion because it gives us something to talk about. And that actually kind of shines a light on how I've always thought about breaking news. There's this obsession. Like, well, who are you really breaking news for?
Yeah.
Is it to flex on other people in your industry? Like, what is the value here? Because again, this comes from working in environments where they were really obsessed with, we have to have this first. We have to have this first. I'm like, what's the value? For 2 minutes, not even.
Yeah.
For 30 seconds, you were like, we had it first. After that, man, I have the news that eventually was going to come out. It's a transaction. It's a signed contract. Eventually, I want to hear, what do you think about this thing?
Right.
Which Shams isn't going to give you that. You talk about people I never want to interview. Adam Schefter.
Yeah.
I never want to interview Adam Schefter because he's just going to tell you about the transaction.
So
if I want Schefter's opinion, he ain't going to give it to you, man.
So one thing that Woj and Shams do better than colleagues that cover other sports is, and look, I hate to put Chris Lowe under a microscope, but I think it's become so naked. Chris Lowe covers the SEC for ESPN.
Yeah.
Chris Lowe will write his columns exactly how Jimmy Sexton, who is like the power agent among coaches, wants them written. Now, I don't have any evidence that he, sends a copy to Jimmy or to Jimmy's assistant or whatever, but there is a reason in the article about how Alabama's coaching search came together and finally hired Kalen DeBoer. There's a reason that there's a line in there that Florida State was ready to hire Lane Kiffin if Mike Norvell ended up becoming the head coach at Alabama.
Gotcha.
Mike Norvell and Lane Kiffin are both represented by Jimmy Sexton.
Gotcha. All right. That makes sense. So anyway, I just hope that whatever you take away from the JJ Redick Laker thing, the real takeaway is the real value in these transactional reporters is not a lot, in my opinion.
So here's my question to you as we close. Has there ever been one where cultivating this relationship has paid off in a way that there's some piece of information that you think, man, I'm so happy Woj or I'm so happy Shams broke that. I'm so happy they gave that to us.
No.
Yeah.
Not a single time.
No.
Not a single time. at all, which is why, as we kind of look forward and we can close the conversation on this, who is the media personality that we will be obsessed with in 2025?
It's a good question. I would have to see whose contract comes up.
Because again, we've been obsessing over Stephen A. Smith. We've been obsessing over Pat McAfee. I have a name.
Okay.
It's actually going to be Nick Wright.
Could be.
Nick Wright will be the sports media person that we will be obsessed with in 2025. I don't know his contract details.
Yeah.
All I know is that Nick, as I've had more time to listen to more podcasts, Nick actually blends better than anybody else. The new, and again, he's approaching 40, so it's not like he's a young guy.
Right.
But I feel like where we are in sports media is a perfect blend for what Nick Wright does, who is a degenerate gambler.
Yeah.
Who makes it entertaining.
Uh-huh.
At first, I didn't quite understand how Nick Wright was becoming a thing because he almost made himself like an avatar for certain people. Mahomes Mountain is a bit, right? He rides for LeBron James, all this other stuff. He's, again, I've got money on XYZ. And he kind of makes himself the story, but he does it in a way that, again, comes back to a central thesis, which I said about Bill Simmons. He has takes.
Yeah.
Say what you want about it. Say what you want about his, riding for Patrick Mahomes or whatever it is. He has takes.
So,
and that's what matters.
So I'm going to give you who we will be talking about in 2025 because I just looked this up.
Okay.
Whose contract expires.
Whose contract is up?
But it ties in perfectly to Nick Wright. You know whose contract is up?
No.
Colin Cowherd's.
Ooh.
And the question to me has always been, and we can get into this more the next time we do one of these business things.
Sure.
The question for Cowherd for me has always been not would he go back to ESPN? What is the next media venture? The question to me is, does he stay at Fox or does he say, you know what? I'm perfectly happy doing my podcast once a week and raking in all this money from the Ringer. Or I'm sorry, from the Volume.
From the Volume.
The company he owns.
I think it's that.
I think so too.
I think it's that.
I think so too. And I will tell you some conversations I have had with Colin next time we do this.
Hey, man. I am not necessarily a fan of Colin Cowherd because he never actually, we talked about how we stand on business. Colin Cowherd never stands on business.
Right.
One week he'll tell you this really, really strong opinion about something. And the next week he completely flips it. And you're like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Wait, didn't last week you just said this reminded you of Apple and how it was going to be this whole thing. And now you're like, acting like you didn't say that the week before.
The better I have
At
gotten.
least Nick owns like, yeah, man, I got.
Right.
I got. What are you going to do?
The better I've gotten to know Colin over the last 5 years, the more I start to think, God, this guy might be the best to ever do this.
He, as a single hosted guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, he might be.
Yeah.
Jim Rome somewhere is lamenting that thought, but
well,
give myself a tongue for that one.
Rack us.
We are out. You might have found this conversation interesting. You might have thought this conversation was stupid. Either way, we appreciate you checking it out. Who knows? Maybe we'll do this more often whenever we get this subscription thing going. That's happening still, right?
Yeah, it'll be soon.
Okay. That's your baby.
Yeah.
That's your baby. So we'll go from there. All right.
I've got a lot of babies right now.
We do have a lot of things cooking right now. All right. Y'all enjoy your 4th. Again, Joe Giglio's conversation with Kevin Keats will come out on tomorrow's podcast. And who knows what we'll have on Wednesday before we blow stuff up.